Hi, I'm Dean, and welcome to the second video in this tutorial series introducing the CodeIgniter 4 web development framework, where we're building the National Parks Explorer web application together. And in this video, we're going to be implementing create, read, update, and delete, otherwise known as CRUD. And we're going to be creating something like this, a dashboard where we can list out the trips that we have in our database. We can add individual trips and then view individual trips, edit them, and delete them. In order to begin, we have to start by creating a database and seeding an initial table with some information, just so we have something to work with. In my case, if I just go over to localhost, I have access to phpMyAdmin through a tab in this dashboard. And here's what it looks like using phpMyAdmin. We're going to create a new database, and we're going to call this one NP Explorer. Create. And it will have 4 columns, so we're going to name this one trips. And our first column is ID. That'll be our primary key, and the index will show as primary, and it will be, that's fine. And we'll have it as an auto incrementing field. It'll be an integer, and we'll give it a length of 11. The next is we're going to use user ID, or to have a column called user ID. We're not going to be using that in this particular video, but eventually we'll be implementing authorization and authentication, and we need to associate each trip to a specific user. So we'll put this in there for now, but we'll be using it in a video yet to come. 11. It will need to be indexed because it'll be acting as a foreign key to the user table when we make that one. So we got that, and that's fine. We'll just leave it that way. And we're going to put in title for a title for each of our trips. It'll be a varchar, and we'll make that 255. And finally, we'll have the body of the entry, and it will be a text field. Okay, we'll keep it really simple like this for now. Later we'll be adding more information, more columns, but this will do for what we need at the moment. So go ahead and hit save. Let's add a couple of entries in just to get us started. We don't have to enter an ID because it's an auto incrementing field. We do have to put in a user ID. So our pretend user right now will be number 1, user ID number 1. The title, I don't know, my trip to Yellowstone will work. It's stone. And for the body, I went to a lorem ipsum generator, loremipsum.io. Looks something like this, and we'll just generate it. We'll just need 1 paragraph, I think, just to have something to fill in the space. And we'll copy that, go back to our tab for phpMyAdmin, and just pop it in there. All right, let's add one more. No need to put in ID. User ID, we'll call this user number 2, and the title will be my trip to Yosemite. And again, we'll go back to our lorem ipsum generator. Let's create something new here just to make sure we're doing this well. And copy it off. Go back to our phpMyAdmin and paste it in for our second entry. Go ahead and submit those. Looks like everything worked correctly. Let's check in the Browse tab and see what we've got. And yeah, we've got a couple of trips, and they have pretend users and some temporary content for us to look at. Okay, so we've done the first step, and now we've got to go back to I want to say CodeIgniter, not CodeIgniter, to Visual Studio Code to begin working on our application here. And we're going to go back to NP Explorer. We have to make a change to our env file, and we'll be doing that next. So we need to make that change to our .env file. It's in NP Explorer, and right at the root there, you'll find it in the public folder. That's the .env file. And what we need to do is connect our database to our application, and this is how that's done. So uncomment the first 4 lines here. Put in the host name. It says that you can use localhost in the documentation for CodeIgniter 4, but I needed to put in my IP address, and it's probably something with my XAMPP setup. So you may not have to, but you might. If it doesn't work, you might want to try this one, 127.0.0.1. NP Explorer is the name of our database. the root user, so we can get into our database, and then the root user password. And I'll be right back with continuing on with this. I finished editing my .env file, and now I'm ready to begin showing you how to make your first model. And models go into the models directory. Remember that directories and naming conventions are important in CodeIgniter 4. And the new model we're going to be creating is called trips model. Sure, I got too much in there. Yeah, trips model. And remember the extension .php. Okay. All right. I'm going to begin doing some cutting and pasting, just because typing and talking at the same time is pretty painful for both of us. So let me start with this. We'll just do a bit at a time, and I will walk you through each line of the code. All of my code will be on the GitHub repository, so if you choose to kind of follow along in this way, you can. So here we go. Paste this in, and as usual, I always seem to miss that first little guy there. Okay. So our namespace is apps model, so I guess that makes sense. We're using CodeIgniter model. That's the class and that we will be extending, and here we're doing that. We're creating our own class called trips model, matching the name of our file, and it's extending CodeIgniter's model class. We're creating a couple of properties here called protected table and protected allowed fields. And the notion in CodeIgniter, which I think is really wise, is they're trying to do their best to provide protection to the database server and your application when it comes to using forms. We'll be using forms obviously to add new trips to the database, and I can't imagine a more vulnerable spot in an application other than forms. I mean, you're inviting people to add and edit information to your database server and your application. So in order to do everything possible, there's this functionality to make sure that in this particular class, the only table that an authorized user can get to is trips, and the only fields that they're allowed to add or edit are title and description, at least at this point. We're also providing a return type. The return type is in CodeIgniter. There's a couple of choices. The one we want to return a data object. So our return type is going to be equal to object. We're going to set it to object. And finally, we're creating our first method, our function getTrips. And getTrips is a way of providing really two different data objects. And you'll notice that in our function here, our method, we have a parameter ID. The notion is, if I want to get a single trip, I'll be passing the ID for that particular trip, right? If I just want one entry from my table, if I want one row. And so if you pass an ID, you're going to get this method that's in the model class called find, and it's going to find an entry in your table that is of a specific ID. So if you want to find one, or you want to find the second entry, number 2, you can find just that single one. If you don't pass this method a parameter, an integer here, then it'll assume that what you want are all the trips. So it'll give you, like the entries in our dashboard, it'll give you each of the trips, and then so it will return a method called find_all from our model class. So yeah, pretty slick way of getting kind of two data objects sort of for the price of one, using one method there. Okay, so our first model. So now we're going to go back and create a controller where we're going to connect the controller using MVC. We're going to connect the model to the controller to the view, and we'll have a complete implementation of the model view controller design pattern, and that's coming up next. Let's save our model and begin working on the trips controller. So controller, we're going to create a new one, new file under the controllers folder, and we're going to call it trips.php. There we go. And I'm going to once again do some cutting and pasting to limit the amount of typing that I'm doing. And so here we go. So I'm going to paste in this first element of our controller. Eventually the controller will give us all of the views and methods needed for all of the CRUD functionality for the trips in our application. But we're just starting out with the first one, which will give us a listing of all the trips, basically the foundation of our dashboard. So let's go through this and what's going on here. Creating a namespace app controllers, that makes perfect sense. We're going to be using our model, trips model, because we're going to need an instance of trips model in order to get the data that we need. We're creating our class now called trips, the name of the class matching the name of our file, trips, and it of course extends the base controller, the stuff you've seen before. We're creating our first method. We're calling it index, and you may remember that's to help us facilitate a little shortened URI segments, and we'll look again at that, kind of review that as we're building out the control panel. We're going to need an instance of our model, and we're going to assign it the name model. The model will be using the keyword new to get it to instantiate our trips model, and we're going to be assigning this this array data trips with this key. From our model class, we're going to find the get trips method. And remember, because we didn't pass a parameter to get trips, we're going to get all the trips. The assumption is if we don't pass a parameter, then what we want are all the trips. So we're going to get all of the rows in our table trips. Finally, we're going to return the view trips message, and we're going to be providing data to that trips message using the view method that's available to us from extending our controller, extending the base controller. So there we go. So we've created our first one. We can't see anything yet because we still need to make this trips message.php, which we will be doing next. I'd like to make a couple of changes before we move on to our trips controller here, trips.php, just to make things a little more clear and to get us a little better organized. I think it'd help. So let's call this trips list. I just want to distinguish it from, we've used that sort of that message ending to our name when we were working on our static files. And let's just make this list. It's more descriptive. Might make it easier to find if we get lost. And the other thing, speaking of getting lost, let's create under our views file. Let's create another subfolder here for our views for the trips called trip views. Remember that? Okay, trip views. So make another subfolder there, just so we're if we need, we're going to be creating quite a few views for this controller, and I think that it'd be nice to have it all in one place. So I think that'll be better. Okay, so if we're going to do that, we got to make some changes here. We got to put in the path that's going to get us to trips list, and that will be trip views. Oh, okay, spell it right. Trip views, and then let's go trips list. Yeah, that's right. So okay, that looks good. Let's save that. A little bit, feeling a little better now. Okay, all right. Let's go on to making our view file here. Enter our new folder called trip views. Let's make a new file called trips, and we'll call it list.php. It's sort of the foundation of our dashboard that we're creating. There we go. And once again, we're going to use our index.html, the one we have under the views folder, just as our boilerplate. So let's open that one up. Oh, so it looks like it's all ready to copy out of there. So we'll copy that one, and we'll put it into the trips list.php. And we're going to haul this out pretty well. There's a bunch of stuff we don't need. We don't need this. This is the a little form for subscribing, and we don't need that here. And actually, we just don't really need very much under the main, other than the main tag here, all the way up. So let's go all the way to, where's my main? There it is. So the main tag with the class container. Let's delete everything within there. So we just have those tags, and we're going to put a table in here that we're going to build. So I've created one, and I'm going to copy and paste that one. So bear with me 1 second as I grab that. Hold on. Let's see, I want to get the whole table. Okay. And we're going to put it right between the main tags here. And let's tab that in just a little bit. Okay, so we're creating a table, and we're going to create some headers here for each of the columns. One for the number, title, description, view, edit, and delete. And then we're going to use this PHP for each loop to go through our data object trips as trip. So we're moving that data, here, but remember we're getting the results of the entire table. So we need to iterate through it, and we're going to use this for each loop to do that. We're going to be creating a table row, and we're going to be creating some columns. The first column will be for the title, trip title. We're using the notation here, this little skinny arrow, to get the property of that data object. And we're running into a brand new function or method here called word limiter, and that's a helper in CodeIgniter 4. And what it means to do is it's the description. We put in a whole paragraph of lorem ipsum. We don't want all that displayed in our dashboard. We just want the first few words, the first 6 words, in that column. And so we're gonna truncate that with this handy little method here, this handy little helper. In order to get that little helper, we got to go grab it. And the way you add a helper to your view, or to any of the methods that you make, or in your application, is to do this. We're going to put it right in the main container, and we're going to call for some help. Paste this in, helper text. There's a whole bunch of these helpers in CodeIgniter 4, and the documentation is really pretty clear in how you launch them, how you grab them, and then how to use them. And they have some pretty good examples, so I think they'll find that helpful. But that's how you get this little text helper in our view, and there we go. Now we got it kind of truncated so that our table is looks a little better. All right, the next column after our description that's been shortened for us a little bit, we're going to create links to the functionality that we need in our trips controller for various functions, or for various CRUD functions. This one is to view an individual one. Haven't made that one yet. This is to edit an individual one. Haven't made that yet. Haven't made that method yet either. And this one is to start the delete function, or the delete process. Haven't made that one yet either. So we're going to be making those and putting them in our trips controller. But there's how you go about getting your access to those functions using the correct URI. And base URL is, again, foreshortening. We have to put in the whole qualified domain name and everything. We can just use base URL. That way, if your base URL changes, this value will change with it. Okay, and we'll be talking about that as we're moving along, as we add each of these methods to our trips controller. Okay, so let's see if this looks right. See if we've at least got our first method in, which is to get all of our trips. I'll save this one, and then we'll go out to our web application. Come on, there we go. First test. We need to type in the controller name in our URI, which is trips. And remember that the first one that will be grabbed, or the one that will be grabbed by default, I should say, is the index function, and that's the only function that we've created so far in our trips controller. And it doesn't like description. Oh, right. So I've run into this before. Let me show you my mistake here. It's really easy. In my example one that I've created, that I'm kind of copying from here, I called the column in my database table, I called it description rather than body. Remember, we named that one body, and so for the whole long paragraphs that we stuck in. And so somewhere here, I'm trying to get trip ID. Where is it? And trip ID, title, description. Okay, there is no trip description. It's the trip body, right? That's what we called it. Whoop, let's call it. Get it right. So missed that. Now I got it. Thank goodness for my debugger tool, body. That's the name of the column in our table trips in our database. So everything should work fine now. Make sure we got that right. Trip body. Yep. Save. Let's try that one. Trips. And there we go. So we've successfully used our data object. We passed it to our controller. The controller then passed that information onto our view, and we've correctly rendered it by iterating through our object. So our data object. So everything worked great. Of course, we've got a whole bunch of buttons that don't work yet. That'll be coming up next. or at least in the next sections. And yeah, and we'll even we'll put an add button up there too, so we can create a new one. All right, so yeah, so that's it for this section, and I'll be back in a minute to begin creating individual views and the edit and delete functions. Let's go back to our trips controller and start adding the method that we need to take a look at an individual trip entry. So if you'll go back to Visual Studio Code, and we'll open up trips.php. Remember, that's under our controllers, trips.php, and we're going to add our next method. And bear with me 1 second here. And here we go. Okay, as our next method, we're going to have one that we're going to call detail. This is to get an individual trip detail. So what we're going to call this function or our method detail, and we're going to pass a parameter ID. Whoop, stop it. Whoops. So yeah, method detail, passing a parameter of ID. We're going to instantiate an instance of our trips model that we've created, and we're going to call it model. We're going to pass the get trips method, the result of that method, which is a data object. We're passing it the ID parameter, and we're returning that to our view in this array with the trip keyword, so that we can display it in our view that we're going to call detail. And actually, we're going to make a couple of little changes to this. I'm going to want to put the view that we're creating into our trip views folder that we just created, that subfolder under views. It's called trips view, trip views. Oh, I can't remember that. Trip views, and I'm going to call this one trip detail, just because I want to differentiate it in case we make any other detail pages for in this particular application, just to make sure that we stay organized here. So we're going to make one called trip detail. Let's be sure to save this file, and we'll go into our trip views folder, views, trip views, and we're going to create a new one, a new file, our new view called trip detail.php. And we'll start this one out. Now, it's going to look very similar to the view that we just created for all of the trips. And so let's open that one, tripslist.php. Go ahead and open that one into your workspace here. And we're just going to copy this out and paste it into our detail view that we're creating. So copy the whole thing out and put it in our tripslist.php. Oh, not trips list, sorry, tripdetail.php. Paste that in. And we don't need this table because we're just going to be looking at one. So scrub the table, hollow that out there, get all that out. So all we have is our main tags. We're not going to need this little helper, so we can get rid of that as well. So we just have this main tag in here. And in that main tag, we're going to put in just a little div for our individual trip entry from our database, from our database table. How about that? Okay, here we go. In main, stick that in there, paste it in. So the div class is container, and that's fine. And we're going to have article, and we're just going to echo out the trip title and the trip body. I don't want to make that mistake again. It's body, right? That's what we've named that column in our table for trips. Okay, trip title, trip body. That looks right to me. We'll save that. All right, let's go out to our application and make sure everything's working properly, and back to Internet Explorer. And this time, our URI segments are trips, detail, and then this is where we pass the parameter for the detail for the ID of the trip that we're looking for. Pass it right as the next segment of our URI. So we've got our domain here, our first segment, which is the controller, the second segment is our method, and lastly is the parameter that method accepts. So that should work. Let's make sure that goes. And there we go. We've got a single entry for my trip to Yellowstone. Okay, so that's working properly. Let's go back to one more time to Visual Studio Code. Make a couple of changes to make sure all of our links are going to work correctly. So let's make sure this is going to happen. Going back to our tripslist.php. So again, that's under views, trip views, trips list.php. And we'll make sure these links are going to work right. These are from my example page, and we've made a couple of changes to our paths. So the first one is for the view button, we need to say trip detail, and actually that's going to work, isn't it? So this is our URL, trips, and then detail is our method. So trips is our controller, detail is our method, and this is the parameter that we're looking for. Remember, we're iterating through this trip as trips in this in our kind of our control panel. So this will get ID number 1, ID number 2, etc., etc. as you move through the loop. So that should work properly. Okay, we haven't built these yet. We haven't built these methods in our controller, but we will. So that looks okay. So let me make sure we save everything. Looks good. Let's go back to our web browser, to NP Explorer. I'm going to make sure that we've gone back to trips and type that in. So that looks good. Let's take a look at the view here, make sure it works right. Oh, there, it's working right. So our links are working properly. Let's go see if we'll go back to our list from here, from this link. And we do. So everything is working properly, and we're ready to go on to the next element of CRUD, which will be to add one. Oh, we got to add that button in too, so we'll do that in just a moment. Let's go back into Visual Studio Code and add a button to our control panel here to create a new trip entry, and we'll call that button Add. So let's go back here, Visual Studio Code. The first thing we want to do is add that button in, and that'll be under Views, trips list.php. That's where our control panel is. And we're just going to put a button in here right underneath this little text helper. I'll copy and paste that in. Pretty simple little addition here. We'll paste it in right here. And it's one little space, have a line break there, and it's just a tag, or a tag. It's an anchor tag going back to trips create, our controller trips, and the create method, which we're going to be building next. And it has a roll of button. It'll look like a button, and it'll class of outline. So with the value of add. So let's just make sure that works properly. Save that. Go back to our NP Explorer, and just to check that out, we'll refresh, and there's our button that says add. Doesn't do anything yet. Nothing happens. But yep, no file found. But yeah, we'll fix that right now. We'll go back to Visual Studio Code and add the new method in our trips.php. So back into our controllers, trips.php, we're adding our next method to create a new trips entry. Okay, so here we go. Let me copy this out. Okay. So this is a little longer one, a little more involved, and I'll walk you through what's going on. So our new method is called create. It requires an instance of the trips model. So we're instantiating one with a new keyword and calling it model. We need another helper called form that'll help us with error validation. And we need to declare the data field as an empty array right now. And that'll make sense as we kind of work through this. Now this create method is really handling two types of requests from the user. We're going to be creating a form to fill in to add a new trip, and initially it will be a get request to the server, right? All I want you to do is I want you to go and we want to go and get the empty form and present it to the user. In addition to that, we want to be able to post the form to this method. So if it's a post request, we want to do something different than if it's a get request. So let me first explain what's going on with a get request. Now, here's what's happening kind of as we're building this. If the request is post, so somebody's filled in the form and they're posting it back to your server, then we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff that I'll talk about in just a second. However, if it's not a post request, skip all of this and just return the view create, which we're going to make, with data. And that's important because there's some data we're going to be used for form validation. But right now, the data field is empty. We just don't have anything we're passing in there. But to avoid getting an error, we got to say, well, it's an empty array. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is show you what the first element of this is. We're going to show the user an empty form. Now let's fix this right now. We know we're not going to be putting that create view directly in the views folder. So remember, we created one called trip views, and we're also going to call our view not create but trip create, just to kind of go with the pattern that we've started with. So it'll be trip create. Okay, we'll just start with that. Now let me walk you through what happens when a user submits a form. They've been presented with a form from the GET request. Now they posted the request back to the create method, right? Oh, okay, look at this. It's a post request. Now I got to do something else. The first thing I'm going to do is identify the validation rules that I want for this form. And in this case, I just made some stuff up, but the notion is the title is going to be required. It's going to have a minimum length of 3 and a maximum length of 255. In addition, the body field is also required for a successful submission. If the case is that the validation rules passed, so that's what's going on here with this method, then I want you to save this information back to my model. So this is a save method that'll push information back to our data object and then pass it back to our model and save it to our database. Okay. Once all of that's completed, you pass the rules and we submitted it successfully to the database, then we're going to return the user, we're going to redirect them to the trips index URI. Remember that the trips is where our index is, where our control panel is, and remember it just has to say trips because index is our default method. So it's going back to our controller with the default method of index. However, if there are errors in the form, if it didn't pass this check right here, then we're going to send some data back to our form with the elements that are wrong. So what CodeIgniter does behind the scenes is it creates a little view that's going to put in our view. It's going to go back and return the view trips create with this new validation data. Okay, so this will probably make a lot more sense if you see it in action, but in order to see it in action, we got to go ahead and make our view for create. We're going to be building our first form. So let's go and create that new view. We're going to call it trip create, and it's going to go in the trips create folder. Well, wow, this is just a mess. Trip, holy smokes, what did I do here? Trip views, just spell everything wrong here. Trip views, and we're going to create a new one called trip create.php. All right, there we go, and it's going to be our first form. Now let's give it some of that good old stuff we need, the HTML that we are kind of using as our boilerplate. And I just happen to have trips list open up here. We can just use that. Just copy all that out, and we'll hollow out the table here. Just getting our boilerplate stuff into our view. So copy that off, go back to trips create, and paste it in. Once again, we're just going to hollow out the table here. We don't need that. Hollow out the table. We don't need a lot of stuff. Let's get right back to our main container. Whoop, main container here. Get that all out of there. Everything from main. Let's get rid of that for our trip create.php. And I'm going to paste in some stuff for the form and walk you through that. So here we go. All right. So let me paste this in the main, within the main tag here. All right, here's good. Paste that in. Here's what's going on. We're just creating some title information to add a trip. This is where you start adding the trip. And then the first thing we're doing is creating a space to show the validation errors if there are any. So if there are validation errors, show them here, list them right here. Then we're going to end the if statement. Creating a form, and the action of the form is going back to trips create, going back to this method that we've created with the method post. So it'll do all that is necessary for a post submission, for a form submission. We're also introducing this new idea of the CSRF field. This is to help prevent cross-site forgery attacks on your site. And I'll go into that a little bit more in detail when we finish off all the forms. Then we're just creating a form. We're going to title, and we're going to put in the information from title. Input type is input. Name of this title. This is a new thing, the value of the thing. So what we want to do, what this has to do with is remembering the submitted values when you check for validation. So in other words, since both of these fields are required, if somebody goes to all the trouble to put in the body information, they typed out really lovely paragraphs about their trip, and then they submit it and they forgot to put in the title, we want the form to remember what they put in for body and just ask, say, hey, you just forgot to put in a title, put that in, and then we'll take the whole thing and it'll pass the rules and be submitted and saved to the database. All right, input type is submit, and the value is create a trip, and just a button there, and then we're ending the form, and then we're putting just a little return to trips button here, just so we can get back to trips if we've if we decide, oh, we didn't really mean to add a new trip, I want to go back to the control panel. All right, so pretty simple little form here, not much going on, but a couple things to remember. Be sure we do want to use this CRF protection notion here, which is right up here, but have that field in there. And the set value is important to make sure that we're, if we get errors, we're not going to just completely return an empty form and just give, hey, you forgot something, you don't get anything back. So let's take a look at what's going on with this in action, and I can, hopefully that'll make it really clear to see how it all works. Let's make sure we've saved everything. And we'll go back to our NP Explorer and see how this all works. So be sure to refresh this. We have an add button here. Let's make sure we get our form. And we get form. Look at that. That worked. So far so good. Let's type in a description here and forget the title. Let's make sure that our error systems are working here. And I'm just going to type in some gibberish, but not Shakespeare, but it's okay. And if I hit create a trip, here's what happens. Oh, I get back, refresh the page, I get back and it says the title field is required, but it remembered my description, so I didn't lose everything. So now if I put in a title, my new trip, and I create a trip, I get back to my control panel, and there's my new trip with all my gibberish. So everything worked out right. So it might be worth just one more look at just to kind of clear this up, because it's kind of, a little bit going on in this new method. Let's go back to trips, our controller, and that's under controllers, and then trips. Just do it here, controllers, and then trips. Where are you, trips? Here you are, trips.php. Our new function was called create. We have a need for our model, so we're instantiating a new trips model. We're calling it model. We need a helper called form. We need an empty data set just so we can have a place to hold our error messages if we haven't passed the validation rules. If it isn't a post request, we're going to deliver to the user the view trip create, and it will be empty. There will be nothing filled into the form, and it obviously won't have any validation errors. Brand new form. Once the user has submitted the form, and now it's a post request, the user is posting something back to the server. Now we're going to run this if statement. We're setting some rules for validation. If it passes the validation rules, then we're going to save this information back to our data object and send it back to our model, and it will update the database. That's what the save method is all about. And then I'm going to return the user, I'm going to redirect the user back to our trips controller, which will show us our control panel, and it will include our the trip that we just added. If there are validation errors, then we're going to give him, this little validator will create those messages for our errors and display them on the view trip create with our validation errors, and it will also remember what we had submitted, assuming we don't get leave both fields empty. Okay, so I hope that's helpful in seeing what's going on. And in the next portion of this video, we'll go on to updating a request. We're ready to add update functionality to our National Parks Explorer web application. We want to get our edit button to work properly now. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we'll start doing the work in our controller and adding the new view that we need. Before we do this, let's take care of a little housekeeping item. If you'll go into our boilerplate view, index.html, so under views, index.html, we keep hollowing out the content between the main tags over and over again. Let's stop doing that. Let's just get rid of it now, and then we'll have a boilerplate that we can continuously go through here, or continuously reference and use. So let's just delete everything between the main tags. So all you have is, between the beginning main tag and the closing main tag, we have nothing, which is exactly the way we want it. Let's save that one for use later. All right, let's go back to our controller, which is under controller, trips.php. And we scroll up a little bit. This is the last one we added, was for create. And now we're going to add two new methods to accomplish updating functionality in our web app. So let's paste that. Let me paste these in and kind of walk you through them. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit so we get them both. The first new method that we're creating is a method called edit, and basically all this is doing is it's presenting a filled-in form with the contents of an existing trip. So it looks very much like, almost identical to, our detail method that we created before that just showed a single trip entry. But now this time, instead of filling out just two paragraphs with information, we're filling in a form. So we're just basically calling a different view with the contents of our form. Right, so basically the same idea here. We're creating our method. We need an instance of our trips model, so we're instantiating that with a new keyword and assigning it the name model. We're putting our object, our data object, and we're making it, we're assigning it to this data array with the keyword trip, and we're finally returning that data to a view that we're going to create called trip_edit. Okay, we'll be building that in just a second, but let me walk you through what's the real muscle in this particular combo between edit and trip update, which is trip update. This is the next one. This works very much like the create method. The notion is that we've got to again have a new instance of our model. So we're going to have a trips model, and we're instantiating that with a new keyword, calling it model. We need to get a helper from CodeIgniter 4 called form. And once again, we're checking to see that this is a post from our user, somebody that hit the submit button to post this, post their entries back to the server. And if they have, then we want to set some rules for validation. We want the title and body to be required, and we have some little more going on. We have a minimum length and maximum length for the title. The same rules that we assigned for our create method. We're checking the validation rules. If it passes, if the validation rules have been met, then we want to update the model. So we're using our instance of our trips model, saying we're using this method there that's available to us called update. We're passing the parameter ID and of course the data that the user has entered into the fields. If that's successful, if they met the validation rules and it successfully updated the database, then we return them to, redirect them to our trips dashboard, which is trips with the default method index. Okay. If it didn't pass the validation rules, then we want to bring the original form back, but fill it up with, first of all, the data, the validation errors, and put that in that little view that CodeIgniter creates for us. And we also want to pass back to that form the information, the entries that the user has created during that session, right? During the time that they put in some information, not all of it's right, didn't pass validation, so it's coming back. But we want to make sure we save the entries that they did include. Another thing we have to do here, because we're working with data objects, is we have to cast this array of information as an object. And in PHP, that's how you accomplished casting an array as an object. This little business right here. Okay. If they didn't pass the valid, now we've got to pass this data back to the form, back to trips edit as this data package, right? As this data array, and there'll be places in there for the validation error and for the entries that have been included for trip, that the user has entered for trip. Okay, so let's take a look at making now our view file, and we'll make that happen. So let's create a new view file under views, trip views, and we're going to create a new file that we're going to call trip edit. That's our view that we need, .php, and make sure we spelled it right. Yep, good. And let me fill that in. First of all, we got to go over to our index.html under views, index.html. We'll bring that up. We're just going to copy everything off. This is the shortened one that we just hollowed out, and it's ready to use now. Copy that. Go over to tripedit.php again and paste that in. And between the main tags now, I'll put in the form that I've created. And this ought to be good. Here, hold on. Okay, we're going to put this in our between our main tags, paste in this new form. We're putting in an article that's Pico CSS's version of CRUD, and just giving it a title: edit your trip, update the details of your trip right here. We want to check for validation errors. So if they're there, we want to display them. That's this method here that we get from the validation class, or the validation class in CodeIgniter. Got to end the if statement. Our form action in this, remember, is trip update. So after it's been filled in, we want to send it to trip update. If it passes through trip update, it will send us back to our controller. And here's our form. We just need to make sure we got our trip ID in here in form action, so it knows which one. And then in our form itself, we have to get the value of the title. This is initially being drawn from our database, right, the original one, and the title and the body. And then we also want to include the ID from from our database, right? So finally, we have our submit button. We submit it, and we also have a link to go back to trips in our form. This will all be clear when we look at it, in real life as in our test. Now, when we hit this submit button, it goes to trip update. If it doesn't pass the validation rules, it comes back to the user with the data that the user has supplied. So it's not going to go back to the database the second time. It's going to get these post elements, these posts that have come from our user. We've got to be sure to pass this ID in again so that when we go to finally get it right, when we finally get it going, the method trip update needs to understand which trip entry it's looking for, which row in that table it's looking for. So let's take a look at this in real life, and I think it'll make a little bit more sense. And let's save all here, and let's go back to our application, MP Explorer. We'll go back to our dashboard, and let's take a look and see if everything's working the way we expect it to. So hit the edit button, and we get our form field. This is called, we've messed around here, and this is called My Next Trip. And let's just take the title out, and we'll put in a different description. We'll take all this stuff out of here. This is, it's a great trip is almost here. All right, our new content, right? But we've forgotten the title. We hit update, and title field's required. But it remembered what I had typed in, right? So, well, let's try it again. Put a title in, and another and another great trip. Okay, so great trip moment here. This is all of our new content. I think I've got everything right. It should pass the validation rules. Hit update, and now it was sent back to the database successfully. And there it is. We have our new information displayed in our control panel. All right, so everything worked like it should. So just as a quick review, because there's kind of a lot going on in these two methods, just to kind of recap, let's go back to under controllers, trips.php, and take a look at these two functions or two methods that we created in our class here. So the first one is edit, and that's basically putting the information from a particular row in our database and pre-populating a form. Once that form has been submitted, the action of the form is trip update, and a couple things are going to happen. First of all, we're going to need an instance of our model, our trips model. We create one of those. We need a little helper so we can use our validation rule methodology here. And if it's a post request, which it is, we're posting some data back to our server, then we're going to check these. We're going to set the rules, and then we're going to check them, the validation rules. If it passes, then everything's great, and it updates the database, and it goes back to the trips control panel, our control panel for our trips. If it doesn't work, then it saves it displays the validation error by assigning the validation errors to this data array with the key validation. It also captures all of the posts that the user has entered into the data array with the keyword of trip. Then it passes all of that data back to the trip edit view. So it's what we want to make sure we don't do is go back, forget to include anything that the user has entered in, and we don't want to go back to the database. So that's what's going on. So quite a bit happening here, but it's all working properly, and yeah, we've accomplished it. And not too many lines of code. We've got our edit functionality to work. All right. The easiest, I think, the most straightforward next two methods for deleting a post are coming right up. We're ready to complete our elements of CRUD functionality in our National Parks Explorer web application by completing the delete functionality. I want the delete button to work. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we'll add the last two methods that we need to create this, to implement this functionality. So here we go. Paste those in. So here's the notion. We want to create two methods. The first method is basically we want to show a confirmation page to the user. Hey, are you really sure you want to delete this? And so this looks very much like the view, the detail method that we've created before. So we're calling this method setDelete. We have to pass it a parameter of ID. We need an instance of our model, so we're instantiating it with a new keyword, and we're calling it model. We're passing our data object, which is using our getTrips method from our model, and passing the parameter of ID. So we're then assigning that to this array data with the keyword trip, and then we're returning that data to our view, and passing that data to our view, and then we're returning the view trip set delete. Finally, if the user does want to delete this particular trip entry, this row in the data table, then we need a function to do that, and we're calling that delete. We need to pass that an ID, and again we're going to need an instance of our model, and then we're going to delete a specific entry from our specific row from our table using the delete method that's available to us through the model that we've created. Finally, we return the user, redirect them to the trips controller and with the method index. So basically getting them back to the control panel that we've created for National Parks Explorer. Okay, so the last thing to do is create the view that we need. And trips views, trips views, we'll create a new file, and we're going to call that trip set delete. Trip set delete. And I don't want to capitalize that, I guess. We'll just do delete. Delete.php. And it's going to look a little bit something like this. Okay. First of all, we want to get our index boilerplate in there one more time. And index.html. Let's copy that out. Go back to our trip set delete page. Paste that in. One thing I forgot to do last time is that we don't need this subscribe business right here, so let's delete that out. That just makes it confusing. So get rid of that. And between the main tags, we'll put in a little bit here. Just appear in a little. Right here. Paste it in, and basically within these article tags, that's basically a card. We're just going to say, hey, are you sure you want to delete the trip? And once the your trip can't be recovered, we're going to display the trip title and the trip body, and then there's going to be a button that says cancel. It'll just simply take you back to the control panel. If you really do want to do it, there's a button here to go to the trips controller, the delete. Better make sure we got that right. Do we call it delete? I think there's an error there. Trips.php. Did we call it delete? Yes, we did. We called it delete. That's fine. Let's go back to our trips set delete page here, and that's the correct method that we're looking for. We need to pass the ID to the delete command, or the delete method, and yeah, it'll appear as a button. That's the role notion from pico.css. So I think everything's there. Let's take a look. Let's save all our files. And let's go to our NP Explorer back in our web browser. And let's make sure that the delete button works. I'm going to delete this first one. See, delete. Oh, we got an error. As an array. Oh, okay. So yeah, this is about using objects and arrays, and this is good to know. So we'll go back to Visual Studio Code. So I'm looking for the content of my object by asking for an array. It doesn't work that way. You've got to use these skinny arrow to actually get the properties of your object. So the trip, and then that's title. That should work. And then trip body. And then finally trip ID. So good to know about that. Two different notions. And ID. All right. So that should work properly now. Let's see. Save. Back to go here. And let's just refresh this one. And there we go. It says, are you sure you want to delete this trip? And if I hit this button that says delete, it will call that delete method from our trips controller. So let's see if that works correctly, and then sends me back to our control panel. And it does. And that one's gone. Number one's all gone. So yeah, so we've done it. We've created our completed CRUD functionality for National Parks Explorer, at least for where our trips table is concerned. And I'll be continuing on with these videos, kind of making this more complete. We've got a lot of work to do, even in this portion. You know, we've got some refactoring to do. We've got some work to make it so that we're not continuously hacking up that index.html. So we're going to take a look at the view component in CodeIgniter 4. It makes it a lot easier, so that we can we can create nested views. We have work to do about protecting our site from CRSF or from cross-site forgery attacks. There's a little more to do there, and of course we got to would be wise to define all of our routes explicitly, so that we're not having this automatic routing going on. But all of that's for a future video. I hope that this has been helpful. If it has been helpful, I hope that you'll like or subscribe. And if you have any comments that you'd like to make or anything that you'd like to see, please let me know. All right, thanks.